I'm Lauren Mitchell. 32 years old and 3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother looked me in the eye and said, "This place isn't for losers." Her voice was calm, practiced as if she were reading from a dinner script. I'd spent the week finishing long shifts at the shop, making sure I could drive out on time for the holiday. The scarf for her and the watch for my dad were already wrapped and waiting by the door. I thought the worst thing I might face that weekend was another round of polite judgment about my job fixing 18-wheelers. But I didn't realize those words, quiet, cruel, and final, would open a wound years in the making. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been made to feel small for honest work. I grew up on the kind of street where the grass had to be cut in straight lines, and everyone waved just long enough to stay respectable. My mom, Ellen, kept our house spotless and our image spotless, too. She was the kind of woman who polished silver before Sunday dinner even if no one was coming. My dad, Mark, worked in city planning, methodical and proud of it, and my little sister, Lily, was the family's golden light, soft curls, bright smile, every moment of her life framed like a Christmas card. I was the opposite. While Lily floated from recital to banquet to prom, I spent my evenings under the hood of an old Chevy I bought with babysitting money. I was 16 when I changed my first set of brake pads. By 20, I could rebuild a carburetor in half the time my shop teacher expected. When I told Mom and Dad I wanted to go to trade school, they looked at me like I'd chosen to live on another planet. Mom said, "Lauren, you're too smart for that. Why not something more respectable?" That word, respectable, followed me like a shadow. Our home-prized presentation over purpose. The way you looked, the way you sounded, even the way you held a coffee cup mattered more than who you really were. Lily played her part perfectly, smiling through every photo and saying exactly what people wanted to hear. I loved her, but I could never match that polish. My hands were always stained with oil. My hair smelled faintly of diesel, no matter how long I scrubbed. Still, I tried to belong. I fixed Dad's lawnmower every spring without being asked. I showed up for birthdays, sent cards, and covered Lily's rent once when she hit a rough patch after college. I thought effort would equal love, that loyalty would eventually win me a place at their table. It didn't. The week before Thanksgiving, I called home to ask what time dinner would start. I wanted to know if I should bring my green bean casserole like always, or maybe try Grandma's bourbon pecan pie recipe. Mom's voice was careful, too careful. "This year's a little different, sweetheart," she said, the phone line going still enough that I heard her breathe. "Lily's bringing someone special home. He's from a well-off family. Harvard graduate, works in venture capital, and she wants everything to go perfectly." I didn't say anything at first. Then came the pause that felt like a blade being sharpened. "She's just worried your job might seem out of place," Mom added. I remember standing there in my hallway, one boot half off, as her words settled. She tried to cushion it with the same gentle tone she used when telling neighbors we'd replaced the porch swing. "You understand, right?" she asked. And I did. I understood exactly. I hung up without arguing. I didn't tell her about the scarf I'd already bought or the shifts I'd swapped to make it home early. I didn't remind her of all the times I'd shown up quietly doing my best to keep the peace. I just whispered, "I understand." Then I stood alone in that small house I'd spent years repairing, surrounded by the quiet hum of everything I'd built with my own hands. The days that followed moved slower than winter itself. Snow began to fall soft and steady, covering the neighborhood in white. I kept working long hours, patching engines that groaned and trucks that refused to start in the cold. Every night I came home, the silence in my kitchen grew a little heavier. The wrapped gifts stayed untouched on the table, a reminder of a seat I no longer had. By Thanksgiving morning, the town was blanketed in frost. I made myself 2 eggs and toast, listening to the creak of the furnace and the wind against the windows. No laughter, no football game playing in the background, just the echo of absence. Around noon, I packed my toolbox and drove across town to Mrs. Halpern's house. She was a retired teacher with a bad garage door opener and a kind smile that made people feel safe. "You're working on Thanksgiving?" she asked. I shrugged, saying it was better than sitting around doing nothing. She offered coffee and kept talking while I fixed the wiring. When I finished, she handed me a slice of pumpkin pie wrapped in foil. "In case you forget how good home can still taste," she said. That line stayed with me the whole drive back. I passed my parents' street, on the way every window in their house glowing warm laughter, spilling out through the curtains. But I didn't stop. I kept driving until the lights disappeared in my rearview mirror. That night, I sat beside the small stove in my living room, watching the fire flicker against the walls. The air smelled faintly of wood and grease, and for the first time in years, I felt still. No one expected anything from me. No one was measuring how I spoke or what I wore. I had no seat at their table, but I had my own chair, my own quiet, my own slice of pumpkin pie cooling on a plate beside me. Outside, snow kept falling in soft, endless patterns, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, the last ember of hope I'd carried for their approval burned low but steady. I didn't know it yet, but that night was only the beginning, the moment before everything I'd built in secret finally came to light. Thanksgiving came and went in silence, but the echo of my mother's words clung to everything around me. I kept the small fire going in the stove that night, letting it fill the house with warmth I couldn't find anywhere else. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the yard in clean white layers that made the world look untouched, even if I didn't feel that way. I went to bed early, listening to the steady hum of the furnace and the empty stillness that followed. When Monday rolled around, I went back to the shop as usual. The smell of oil and diesel felt like home in a way nothing else did. I spent the morning replacing a clutch on an old Peterbilt Hands moving on instinct. Every sound of a wrench hitting steel was a reminder of where I belonged. My coworkers joked and played country music from a crackling radio, and I laughed along when I could. But by the time lunch rolled around, I caught myself staring out the open bay door at the falling snow, wondering if my family had even mentioned my name that weekend. Growing up, the Mitchell house had been all about appearances. The curtains were always perfectly pressed, and the dining table had more rules than some workplaces. My mom insisted on matching napkins for every holiday meal, even when it was just the four of us. Dad's voice was steady and polite, but distant, the kind that filled a room without ever touching it. Lily was the one who brought sparkle, her laughter, her confidence, the ease with which she fit into any situation. When people came over, she always knew what to say. I was usually the one refilling glasses or sneaking off to the garage to tinker with something that actually made sense. It wasn't that my parents were cruel. They just measured worth in a language I never learned to speak, one made of degrees, job titles, and social polish. When Lily went off to college, they threw a backyard party big enough for the whole neighborhood. When I enrolled in trade school, they sent a check for tuition and a note that said, "Good luck, we hope it's a phase." That was my celebration. I worked through my 20s, saving what I could, learning the rhythms of engines and the quiet peace that came from fixing something with my hands. I learned how to tell when a motor was healthy just by the hum it made. The work was hard, but it was mine. I didn't expect applause for it. It was sometime in my second year at the depot when I heard a late-night podcast about investing. The words meant almost nothing to me at first, dividends, index funds, compounding, but they stuck. The next day, I went to the library and checked out a stack of finance books that looked older than I was. The librarian smiled and asked if I was starting a new career. I just told her I was curious. I read every page, every margin note, every chart. Within months, I opened my first account and put in everything I could spare. I remember the first time I bought a single share of stock in a freight company I'd worked with. It was less than $100, but when that confirmation email came through, it felt like the world shifted slightly. I didn't tell anyone, not my parents, not even Jada. It wasn't a secret out of shame, it just felt safer that way, like keeping a piece of my life unspoiled. From there, it became a rhythm. Work, save, learn, invest. I skipped vacations and new clothes, bought tools secondhand, and poured every spare dollar into the market. I started small, but the numbers grew slow and steady, like an engine running at the perfect idle. When I finally bought my house, a tired old place with a leaky roof and a furnace that coughed more than it heated, it felt like victory. I fixed every inch of it myself. I didn't need anyone to see it. I just needed to know I could. By the time I hit 30, my accounts were worth more than I ever imagined possible for someone who worked with her hands. I didn't flaunt it. I still drove my old pickup and wore the same jackets I'd owned for years. But I kept detailed spreadsheets, every number logged like clockwork. And as those numbers climbed past 1,000,000, something inside me shifted, not pride exactly, but a quiet knowing that I'd built something real piece by piece. Then came the knock on my door. It was 5 days after Thanksgiving. I'd just crawled halfway under a flatbed truck in my garage when I heard tires crunching over the snow outside. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out expecting a delivery or maybe a neighbor. Instead, my parents stood in the driveway, bundled in their winter coats with Lily right beside them. Mom held a tin of cranberry muffins, her expression too cheerful to be genuine. Dad stood stiffly, hands tucked into his pockets. Lily's face, though, that was pure fury. "Lauren." Mom called softly like she was afraid of being too loud. "We thought we'd drop by, check on you." I crossed my arms, leaning against the garage door. "Check in." After telling me Thanksgiving wasn't for losers. Lily stepped forward, her breath visible in the cold air. "You should have told me," she snapped. "Told you what?" "That Evan used to work for you." The name stopped me cold. Evan Brooks, her new boyfriend. The one Mom said was too successful for me to meet. I stared at her, trying to understand what she meant. She continued, her voice tight with anger. "He told us everything. About how you trained him at the shop, how you kept him from getting fired when he wrecked that client's axle. How he said you basically taught him the job from scratch." Mom's face had gone pale and Dad shifted uncomfortably beside her. And that's not all Lily went on, her words gaining force. "He said you taught him about investing, showed him your spreadsheets, told him to think long-term. He told us how much you've made, how you have over $1,000,000 tucked away, and never told anyone." The air between us was still. I looked from one face to the next, none of them meeting my eyes. "No," I said quietly. "I didn't tell anyone." Mom took a small step forward. "We had no idea, sweetheart." "Would it have mattered?" I asked. "Would I have been welcome if Evan hadn't said something?" They didn't answer. Dad finally cleared his throat. "It's not about the money, Lauren." I laughed once, a sound sharper than I meant it to be. "Isn't it?" Lily's cheeks flushed. "You made me look foolish in front of him. He thought I was lying about you, and now he knows how wrong I was." "I didn't make you do anything," I said. "You chose to be embarrassed by me." Mom glanced at Lily, then back at me. "We came to apologize," she said, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "And we thought maybe we could talk. Evan's starting a new business, auto parts distribution. He thinks you two could work together, combine your strengths." There it was, the pitch, hiding under the apology. I stepped back toward the garage, the scent of metal and motor oil cutting through the winter air. "You came to say sorry," I said, "but you brought a business plan." Lily's tone turned sharp. "It's called building something, Lauren. You of all people should understand that." "I do," I said. "That's why I built it without you." Then I turned and walked inside, leaving them in the cold. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt heavier than usual, as if their voices still hung in the air. The tin of muffins sat untouched on the counter, its lid fogged from the chill. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, listening to the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, frost crept up the window panes, shining faintly in the moonlight. I thought about what Lily said about being embarrassed, about how quickly their tone changed once they learned the truth. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. I had spent my whole life proving my worth through work, through kindness, through patience, and still, it took a number in a spreadsheet for them to see me differently. By morning I knew one thing for sure: if they came back, it wouldn't be to make peace. It would be to make use. And they did. When the knock came again 2 days later, I already knew who it would be, but this time I was ready to answer it on my own terms. The second time they showed up, it was early morning. Frost clung to the windows and the air carried that dry chill that makes every sound sharper. I'd been out in the garage for hours, already finishing up a starter replacement on an old Freightliner, when I heard the familiar rumble of tires in my driveway. I didn't even need to look to know who it was. I wiped my hands on a towel and stood in the open doorway as my parents' sedan rolled to a stop. Mom stepped out first, bundled in her red wool coat, her breath fogging in the cold. Dad climbed out slower, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. They looked like people rehearsing for something they weren't sure they could say out loud. "Hi, sweetheart," Mom said softly, forcing a smile. "Can we come in?" I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door wide enough for them to pass. Not because I was ready to forgive, but because I needed to hear what they'd come to say. The living room was warm, smelling faintly of coffee and wood smoke. The scarf I'd bought for Mom still sat in its gift bag on the table where I'd left it weeks ago. She noticed it immediately, but said nothing. We sat down, Dad in the armchair, Mom on the couch beside me. The silence stretched long enough for the ticking of the old wall clock to sound like a heartbeat. Finally, Mom broke it. "We made a mistake, Lauren," she said. "A big one." "Yeah," I said quietly. "You did." Dad cleared his throat. "We were wrong to exclude you. We didn't mean to hurt you." I looked at him for a moment, steady and calm. "You didn't mean to. You told me Thanksgiving wasn't for losers. You just didn't think I'd push back." He looked down, his face flushed. Mom reached for my hand, but I didn't move. "I want to be clear," I said. "I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to be convinced." Mom's eyes glistened. "We're not here for money, I swear." "Then why now?" I asked, my voice even. "Why only after you found out what I've built?" They exchanged a glance. One of those silent exchanges people use when there's no honest answer to give. Dad tried again. "We didn't know, Lauren. We didn't understand." I leaned forward slightly. "And if Evan never said a word, would you be sitting here?" Neither of them spoke. The weight of that silence said everything. I looked between them, feeling years of words I'd swallowed gathering all at once. "I'm not ashamed of my work. I never have been. The only thing I regret is letting your silence shrink me for so long." Mom's voice trembled. "We were trying to protect Lily's moment. We didn't mean to erase yours." "But you did," I said. "You erased me every time you decided who was worth being proud of. And I went along with it thinking if I just kept showing up, you'd finally see me." Dad rubbed his hands together slowly. "So what happens now?" I stood up, walked to the front door, and opened it. Cold air swept in, curling around our feet. "What happens now," I said, "is that you decide whether you can love me for who I am, not who you wish I'd been. But you do it from the other side of this door." Mom stood, her mouth trembling like she wanted to speak, but didn't know how. I didn't fill the silence for her. I let it stay. After a long moment, they both walked out, their footsteps crunching over the snow. I closed the door gently behind them, not out of anger, but out of peace. For a while, I just stood there listening to the wind move across the porch. The house was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt steady. In the days that followed, I went back to work, but something in me had shifted. The noise of the shop, the clang of tools, the hiss of air compressors no longer blurred out the thoughts in my head. Each sound reminded me of what I'd built from scratch, of how every part of my life had been tightened, tested, and rebuilt by my own hands. The calls from my family stopped. No texts, no follow-ups. The quiet was different now, less like loneliness, and more like recovery. I filled my time with projects that made sense. I rebuilt a friend's old pickup, replaced the flooring in my kitchen, and spent evenings reading by the fire. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a phone call that would never come. Weeks turned into months. Winter loosened its grip, and spring crept in slow but certain. One afternoon, I stopped by the community center where Jada volunteered, dropping off a few spare tools for their trade workshop. The place smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee, two scents that always meant comfort to me. Jada waved from across the room. "Hey, stranger," she said. "You look lighter." "Guess I finally stopped carrying things that weren't mine," I said. She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words behind it. We talked for a while about the garage program, about how some of the younger women were learning engine basics. She asked if I'd ever think about teaching a class, maybe just once a month. I told her I'd think about it. That night I drove home as the sun dipped low over the horizon. The air was soft with that early spring warmth that makes the roads shine like glass. For the first time, I didn't turn down my parents' street out of habit. I drove straight past it, heading home to my own quiet driveway, to the life I'd built on purpose. When I stepped out of the truck, I noticed the apple trees I'd planted last fall had started to bud. tiny green leaves pushing through the branches stubborn against the last traces of cold. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, listening to the soft hum of the evening. It wasn't peace I felt exactly. It was something sturdier than that. A kind of grounding that doesn't ask for permission. Inside the house glowed in the light of the setting sun. The scarf I'd bought for Mom still sat on the table untouched. I didn't move it. It wasn't a wound anymore, just a reminder of a chapter that had closed. When my phone buzzed later that night, I didn't recognize the number right away, but the voice on the other end was one I knew. Lily. Hey, she said quietly. I wanted to say I'm sorry for how everything happened. I stayed silent, letting her speak. I talked to Evan, she continued. He really believes this business idea could work with you involved. I closed my eyes. Because of my money, I said. Because of your experience, she corrected quickly. And yes, the money helps too. But he respects you, Lauren. He sees what we didn't. Her tone softened. Maybe this could be a chance to fix things, to build something together as sisters. I took a slow breath. Lily, I said, do you even know what I do each day? You fix trucks, she said after a pause. I diagnose electrical systems in vehicles that weigh 10 tons, I said. I manage a team of 7. I keep rigs on the road that feed half the country. I've built something real, and I built it alone. She was quiet for a moment. That's why I think we could make this work, she said finally. If I'd said yes before you knew about Evan, before you knew about the money I asked, would I have been welcome at Thanksgiving? No, she whispered. I was embarrassed. I nodded to myself, though she couldn't see it. Then this isn't about pride, Lily. It's about boundaries. If you ever want to rebuild something real with me, it won't start with a business deal. Don't throw away an opportunity because of pride, she said again, her voice rising just slightly. This isn't pride, I said. It's peace. I ended the call and set the phone on the table. The house was silent again, the way it had been that first Thanksgiving morning, but it didn't ache anymore. Outside, the last bit of daylight slipped behind the trees, and I watched the faint glow fade from the windows. Tomorrow, the world would move on like it always did, engines to fix bills, to pay small things to tend to. And somewhere between the hum of the shop and the bloom of those apple trees, I'd find my next step. Because even if my family still couldn't see it, I finally did, and that was enough for now. The weeks after that call from Lily felt still like the air before a summer storm. Nothing dramatic happened, no raised voices or slammed doors, just a kind of quiet that settled deep into the house. I kept busy work chores, small repairs, but every night when I came home, the stillness met me like an old companion. My phone stayed silent, except for the occasional text from Jada checking in. The silence didn't sting anymore. It simply reminded me that peace can feel strange after years of noise. At the shop, winter had turned to mud season, the time when snowmelt made every road a mess, and every truck came in with a new complaint. I spent long days on my back, under engine sleeves soaked and fingers numb, the rhythm of the work grounding me. There was something about fixing what was broken that always made sense, more sense than people did. But no matter how many hours I filled, the same thought kept circling back. What now? The answer came from somewhere unexpected. It started with a voicemail from the local community center asking if I'd consider speaking at a small workshop on financial basics for trade students. They wanted someone who understood blue-collar work and money from the ground up. My first instinct was to say no. I wasn't a public speaker. I fixed trucks. But the next day, when I mentioned it to Jada over coffee, she smiled in that way that always meant she'd already decided for me. Lauren, she said, stirring her cup, you've been doing this quietly for a decade. Maybe it's time to let someone else learn from it. I didn't answer right away. Outside the diner window, a plow moved down Main Street, clearing the last slush from the curbs. You think anyone would listen? I asked finally. Not, think, she said. I know. So I said yes. The following Saturday, I stood in a drafty classroom at the back of the community center with a whiteboard marker in hand. A dozen faces looked back at me, young mechanics, welders, electricians. Most still wore their work shirts, names stitched over the pockets. I started simple explaining how I'd opened my first brokerage account with $700, how I learned about compound interest from a library book. My voice trembled at first, but the longer I spoke, the steadier it got. When I mentioned how I'd built my portfolio while living paycheck to paycheck, someone in the back nodded. Then another. By the time I finished, a few stayed behind to ask questions. One girl couldn't have been more than 20, waited until the room emptied. Her name was Kayla. She said she'd been scared to start saving because she barely made enough to cover rent. "You don't have to start big," I told her. "You just have to start." She smiled and thanked me before leaving, and I stood there a while after she'd gone, staring at the whiteboard filled with my shaky handwriting. For the first time in months, I felt something shift. Not revenge, not validation, just purpose. Word must have spread faster than I expected. Within a few weeks, the center called again, asking if I could run another session. Then a local radio host invited me to talk about women in trades and financial independence. The thought made me laugh at first. I'd spent years hiding what I'd built, and now people wanted to hear about it. I said no to the radio, but I kept saying yes to the workshops. By late spring, my Saturdays were spent in that same classroom answering questions about budgeting and small investments, teaching how to read a pay stub or start a retirement account. Some days I brought in tools and showed how knowing your worth wasn't just about money, it was about respect for your own time and skill. Each week, a few more faces showed up. The chairs filled faster than the coffee pot emptied. It wasn't about the numbers anymore. It was about seeing people walk out the door believing they could build something too. One evening after locking up, I found a folded note tucked under my truck's windshield wiper. The handwriting was neat but hesitant. It said, "Thanks for showing me that worth isn't something you prove, it's something you carry." There wasn't a name, just that sentence. I read it twice before slipping it into my glove box. That small piece of paper weighed more than all the certificates and titles my family ever praised Lily for. At home, the apple trees I'd planted were blooming. Their branches stretched over the fence line, dotted with white flowers that glowed faintly in the porch light. I spent quiet evenings there, sipping coffee, listening to the hum of crickets. My world had become smaller, but also richer in ways I hadn't expected. Then one afternoon in early summer, while I was changing the oil on a delivery truck, my phone buzzed. It was a number I hadn't seen in months. "Dad." I hesitated before answering. "Hi, Lauren," he said, his voice cautious, the way people sound when they're afraid of breaking something fragile. "Your mom and I were wondering if we could come by." I wiped my hands on a rag. "What for?" "We just want to talk," he said. "No pitches, no plans." Something in his tone made me pause. "Tomorrow evening?" I said finally. 6 o'clock. The next day, right on time, their sedan pulled into the driveway. I met them at the door, not cold, but not open either. Mom carried a dish of peach cobbler. "Homemade," she said softly, as if that detail still meant something. They sat at my kitchen table while the coffee brewed. The silence between us felt lighter this time, less like punishment, and more like waiting. Mom spoke first. "We saw the article in the paper," she said. "About your workshop. About what you're doing for those young women." She smiled faintly. "It was impressive." I nodded, unsure how to answer. Dad leaned forward. "We didn't realize how much you'd built, how many people you've helped." I kept my hands around my coffee mug, letting the warmth steady me. "It's not about the money," I said quietly. "It never was." He nodded. "I know that now." For a long time, none of us spoke. The clock ticked, the coffee steamed, and outside the light began to fade. Mom's eyes lingered on the apple trees through the window. "You've made a nice life here," she said softly. "I have," I said. "It's mine." She looked down, her hands folding together in her lap. "I'm sorry, Lauren, for all of it. We thought we were protecting Lily, but really we were just protecting the version of family we wanted people to see. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was the first one that felt like it came from the heart." I nodded. "Thank you." When they left, Mom hugged me lightly at the door. Dad just gave a small nod, like the kind of approval I used to crave but no longer needed. As their car disappeared down the street, the house grew quiet again, but this time the quiet was different. It wasn't loneliness, it was space. I sat on the porch for a while watching the last of the sunset fade into deep blue. The apple blossoms swayed gently in the evening breeze. I thought about how long it had taken me to get here, not the house or the money, but the peace to sit in my own skin without waiting for someone else to see my worth. Inside, my phone buzzed again. A message from Jada Community Garage needs another guest speaker next month. You in? I smiled and typed back, count me in. The porch light flickered on, casting a warm glow across the yard. I stayed there until the stars came out, the same steady hum of the world, wrapping around me like an old engine running smooth. I didn't know what the next chapter would bring, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going backward. And for the first time in my life, that felt like freedom. Summer rolled in slow that year, the kind of humid heat that made everything shimmer by noon. Work at the shop picked up again, broken air conditioners and semis, overheated engines, drivers cranky from long hauls. It was exhausting, but steady. Each morning I left my house early, drove past quiet cornfields, and thought about how much life could change without the world noticing. The workshops at the community center had grown larger. What started as a handful of curious students had become a packed room every Saturday. Sam Ortiz, who managed the program, asked if I'd help set up a series of sessions: budgeting, investing, trades management. I told him I wasn't a teacher. He smiled and said, "You already are, Lauren. You just don't stand behind a podium." That first class in the new series filled every chair. Mechanics, welders, nurses, even a few retired workers sat listening, some taking notes in small spiral pads. I used the whiteboard drawing simple charts showing how I started from nothing but a steady paycheck and the discipline to learn. There were questions, laughter, and a kind of quiet energy I hadn't felt in a long time. I stayed afterward talking with people who wanted to open accounts or plan their futures. It was practical, not polished, but it mattered. One afternoon after a workshop, a man about my dad's age stopped me in the parking lot. "I brought my daughter today," he said. "She's been scared to start over since her divorce. You gave her hope." I didn't know what to say. I just thanked him, but the drive home that night felt different. For once I didn't think about what I'd lost with my family. I thought about what I'd found in their absence. At home, the apple trees were heavy with blossoms, petals falling like snow when the wind blew. I spent my evenings on the porch writing notes for the next class, the smell of engine oil still clinging to my hands. Jada came by, sometimes dropping off coffee and teasing me about becoming Miss Wall Street in work boots. We'd laugh, but I could tell she was proud. It was late July when I saw Lily's name pop up on my phone again. The message was short: "Can we talk? It's important." I hesitated for a long time before calling back. Her voice sounded different, less sharp, more unsure. "Evan left the business," she said quietly. "Things fell apart. I don't know what to do next." I didn't gloat. I didn't remind her how she'd looked at me months earlier. I just listened. She said she'd been offered some freelance PR work, but wasn't sure how to make it steady. Then she asked almost shyly if I'd look over her finances with her. "You don't owe me anything," I said gently, "but I'll help you get organized." The following weekend, she drove down to my house for the first time in years. I saw her step out of the car, no cameras, no pretense, just Lily in jeans and a t-shirt, looking uncertain. Inside, she glanced around like the house held memories she'd missed. We sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, going through bank statements and plans. I showed her how to track spending, how to build an emergency fund, and how to set goals that made sense. She asked questions this time, real ones, and for once, she listened. When we finished, she looked up from the screen. "You're really good at this," she said quietly. "I've had some practice," I replied. She smiled, faint but genuine. "I'm sorry, Lauren, for everything." I nodded. "I know." After she left, the house felt calm again, but not empty. Something about her visit felt like a door closing softly, not slamming. Maybe we were both learning where our boundaries ended and something like forgiveness began. Weeks passed. The community program expanded into a mentorship project. Sam asked if I'd oversee a new garage initiative, hands-on learning for young women entering the trades. The thought made me nervous, but he insisted it needed someone who knew the work, not just the theory. I agreed. By September, we had our first group. 10 women, all nervous at first, standing in a row beside a line of used engines we'd salvaged from local shops. I showed them how to loosen bolts without stripping the threads, how to check compression, how to listen for what an engine was trying to tell them. The sound of laughter and clanking tools filled that space like music. One afternoon, as we cleaned up after class, one of the students, Kayla, the same young woman from months earlier, handed me a card. Inside it read, "Thank you for teaching me that strength doesn't have to be loud." I folded it carefully and slipped it into my back pocket. That evening, I drove home with the windows down. The sun was setting behind the fields, painting the sky in deep orange and pink. It felt like the world had finally slowed to match my pace. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed an envelope taped to my front door. The handwriting was familiar, my mother's. Inside was a short note. "We're proud of you. We mean it this time. Love, Mom and Dad." Beneath the words was a photo one from years ago. Lily and I sitting side by side in the backyard dirt on our knees, grinning at something just out of frame. I set it on the table and stared at it for a long while. The next morning, I brought the photo out to the porch. The air was crisp, the first cool breeze of fall brushing through the trees. I poured myself a cup of coffee and watched the light shift across the yard. I didn't call them back right away. I just sat there, letting the quiet hold me. For the first time, the past didn't feel heavy. It felt like soil, something that could grow from if you let it rest long enough. Later that week, during a workshop, Sam approached me with a grin. "We got funding," he said, "enough to keep the garage open year-round, and they want you to lead it permanently." I didn't answer at first. I looked around at the students laughing over their projects, at the oil stains on the floor, at the sound of work humming through the air. It wasn't fame or forgiveness that brought me here. It was steady, honest work and the courage to keep showing up. "Tell them yes," I said finally. "I'll stay." That night I walked through my backyard under a clear sky, the apple trees heavy with fruit. I reached up and picked one, biting into it as the stars blinked overhead. The taste was sharp and sweet. Years of patience finally ripened. And somewhere deep down I knew this was only the beginning of what I was meant to build. The garage initiative kept me busier than I'd been in years. Every week brought new students, new questions, new engines in need of fixing. Some days I was knee-deep in grease beside teenagers, just learning how to handle a wrench. Other days, I sat across from adults starting over after layoffs, teaching them how to rebuild what life had taken apart. The space hummed with motion tools, clinking fans turning, and people discovering their own capability. It was noisy, imperfect, and alive. In early October, the center held its first open house to celebrate the expansion. Sam insisted on banners and coffee urns, the works. The mayor came for a quick handshake, and a few reporters from the local paper circled around with cameras. I'd never liked attention, but that morning I stood in front of the group and thanked everyone who showed up. "This started with one class and a borrowed whiteboard," I said. "Now it's a place where people come to build not just engines, but confidence." The room broke into applause, and for a moment I saw faces, some tired, some proud, all smiling back. After the event, as I was locking up, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "You clean up pretty well for a mechanic." I turned, and there stood my father. He held a paper cup of coffee, his posture unsure. "Your mother told me about today," he said. "She wanted to come, but she didn't want to make you uncomfortable." I wasn't sure how to respond. He looked older than I remembered, lines deeper around his eyes, hair thinner at the temples. "I'm glad you came," I said finally. He nodded, shifting his weight. "You've done something here, Lauren. I don't think I ever told you how proud that makes me." It wasn't much, but from him it felt like a full confession. We stood there in the quiet, the scent of motor oil hanging in the cool air. For once, we didn't need to fill the silence. Later that evening, back at home, I found an envelope on my porch. Inside was a clipping from the town newspaper, a photo from the open house with my name under the headline, "Local Mechanic Leads Empowerment Program for Women in Trades." Beneath it, in my mother's handwriting, was a single line, "We were wrong. You never needed our approval. You were teaching us all along." I folded the note and slipped it into the same box where I kept old pay stubs and certificates, small reminders of how far I'd come. That night I sat on the porch with Jada, 2 mugs of coffee between us, the air thick with the smell of fallen leaves. "Think they mean it this time?" she asked. "I think they're trying," I said. "That's enough." A week later, Lily called again. Her voice carried that nervous tremor I recognized from when we were kids. "I'm working with a local nonprofit now," she said. "We're starting mentorship programs for girls interested in media. I want to do it right this time, no shortcuts." "That's good, Lily," I said. "You'll be good at that." There was a pause. "I used to think success was about who noticed me," she said quietly. "Now I think it's about what I can leave behind." I smiled to myself. Sounds familiar. As the months went by, life found its rhythm again. The garage became more than a workplace. It became a kind of refuge. People brought their stories there, lost jobs, broken marriages, second chances. We fixed what we could engines, sure, but sometimes more than that. I stayed late most nights, the hum of the space settling into something steady and comforting. Then one cold evening in December, I came home to find both my parents sitting on my porch swing. The sight stopped me in my tracks. Mom was wrapped in a wool shawl, Dad holding a thermos between his hands like a peace offering. "Your mother wanted to bring something by," Dad said. "It's just hot cocoa," Mom added quickly, smiling a little. "And maybe an overdue thank you." We went inside. The house glowed softly under the warm kitchen light. They looked around like they were seeing it for the first time. The worn wood floors, the shelves lined with framed photos from the workshop, the faint smell of coffee and soap. "This place feels like you," Mom said. "I guess it does," I replied. We sat down and the conversation started slow. They told me about small things, neighbors moving away, Lily visiting home for Christmas. Then Mom's voice softened. "We hurt you," she said. "Not just that Thanksgiving. For years. I can't change it, but I want to understand how to do better." Her eyes were glassy, but her tone was steady. I watched her hands, still neat, still careful, but this time they weren't folded in judgment. They were open. "I know," I said quietly. "I just needed to stop trying to earn what should have been given." Dad exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have had to teach us that." The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, like something rebuilding itself from the ground up. We talked until the fire burned low. Not about money or accomplishments, but about the small moments that had slipped away. Sunday pancakes, shared jokes, memories buried under pride. When they finally stood to leave, Mom hesitated by the door. Next time she said softly, "Come home for dinner. No titles, no tests, just family." I nodded. Maybe. After they left, I stood at the window, watching the snow begin to fall. The world outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after years of noise. I thought about how long I'd spent chasing approval, how much lighter it felt to stand still and let the truth settle where it belonged. A few days later, I received an email from the Regional Trades Council. They'd heard about the program and wanted to sponsor a statewide training initiative under my direction. It was more responsibility than I'd ever imagined taking on. I accepted without hesitation. That night, Jada dropped by to celebrate. We sat on the floor of my living room eating takeout Chinese, laughing until tears rolled down our cheeks. "You realize you're officially the boss of something bigger than all of us now," she teased. "Guess I'll need better work boots," I said. When she left, I stepped out to the porch again. Snow had blanketed the apple trees, their branches bending under the weight, but not breaking. The night was still, the sky washed in silver light. I thought about every version of myself that had stood here before, hurt, angry, hopeful, rebuilding. Each one had led me here. The next morning, I walked into the garage early. The air was crisp tools cold in my hands. The first student arrived just after sunrise, her breath clouding in front of her. "You're early," I said. She smiled. "Couldn't wait to start." And just like that, the day began again. The engines roared to life one by one, their steady rhythm filling the room. I felt the vibration through the concrete floor, deep and familiar, a heartbeat I knew by sound. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, pale and new. I wiped my hands on a rag, looked around at everything growing from what once felt like ruins, and realized the work wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about proving that some things once rebuilt with care run stronger than they ever did before. and though I didn't know it yet, that truth was about to be tested one last time. The first snow of January came heavy, falling in thick flakes that turned the town quiet by mid-afternoon. At the garage, the heaters hummed, and the smell of diesel mixed with coffee as my crew worked through the backlog of winter repairs. By now, the program had expanded so much that every bay was full, every workbench covered in half-repaired engines and stray bolts. It was messy, noisy, and alive in a way that reminded me why I loved the work. That week, the Regional Trades Council confirmed the funding for the state initiative. Sam and I spent long nights drafting plans and budgets, figuring out how to bring similar programs to other towns. The idea that something I'd started with one class could reach hundreds of people didn't feel real yet. Every detail mattered: equipment lists, insurance, staffing, but beneath all of it was something steady, the quiet sense that I had built this from the ground up without anyone's permission. One morning after the students left, Sam poked his head into my office. "Got a minute?" he asked. He stepped in holding a folded letter. "This came for you, mailed to the center." I opened it expecting some routine correspondence. Instead, the handwriting stopped me cold. It was my father's. The letter was short, written in his usual neat script. "We wanted to thank you again for letting us visit. Your mother's been reading every article about your work. We'd like you to come by for Sunday dinner. No speeches, no expectations, just us." I read it twice before setting it on the desk. It wasn't dramatic, just steady like a bridge quietly being rebuilt. That Sunday, I drove the old pickup across town as snow flurries drifted through the air. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly the same, but somehow smaller. My mom met me at the door wearing an apron dusted with flour. "You made it," she said, smiling nervously. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and roast chicken. My dad stood by the window carving slices of bread. Lily was there too, setting out plates. For a moment, the sight of them all together felt like a memory I'd forgotten how to hold. Dinner was cautious, at first small talk over mashed potatoes and stories about Lily's nonprofit work. But as the evening went on, something softened. Mom asked questions about the program, about the women I'd been teaching. Dad listened closely, nodding every so often. It wasn't the same as before. It was quieter, more careful, but it was real. When I stood to leave, Mom walked me to the door and hugged me longer than she ever had. "You turned out exactly as you were meant to," she whispered. "We just didn't see it soon enough." The drive home that night was silent except for the soft rumble of the tires over snow. Streetlights glowed like halos along the road. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to brace myself for disappointment. Weeks passed quickly after that. The new year came with bigger projects, new faces at the garage, and more calls from other towns asking about the program. Sam and I worked 12-hour days building partnerships with schools and trade associations. The community center became something of a hub. People dropped off tools, donated equipment, volunteered their time. The sound of possibility filled the air like music. Then late one Thursday evening, as I was locking up, Sam stopped me by the door. "You're being nominated for the State Achievement Award," he said, grinning. "I just got the confirmation." I laughed in disbelief. "You're kidding." "Nope. You'll get a letter in the mail. Ceremony's in March." The news spread faster than I expected. Local papers ran short articles. The mayor sent a formal congratulations. It wasn't fame exactly. It was acknowledgement, the kind that used to feel out of reach. A few days later, Mom called. "We heard about the award," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Your dad's been showing the article to everyone. You should have seen him at the diner. He handed copies to strangers." I smiled. "That sounds like him, Lauren," she said softly. "I'm proud of you. We both are." The ceremony came on a mild day in March, the kind that hinted at spring. The event was held in a grand hall downtown, all polished wood and soft lights. I wore a navy dress that Jada insisted I buy, and she came along for moral support. "You're going to knock them dead," she whispered as we walked in. I didn't make a speech. The council chair read my name, handed me a plaque, and said something about leadership resilience and breaking barriers. The applause that followed was polite at first, then warm and steady. I looked out over the crowd and saw my parents in the second row, smiling through tears. After the ceremony, we all went out for dinner. Mom held the plaque in her hands like it was made of gold. "I used to worry about you, you know," she said. Not because of your work, but because you didn't fit into the picture we'd drawn. I see now you were drawing your own." Lily raised her glass. To Lauren, the one who taught the rest of us how to rebuild. It was a small toast, but it felt like closure. That night when I got home, I set the plaque on my desk beside the photo of the first workshop class. The two things didn't seem that far apart, one beginning, one acknowledgement. I turned off the light and stood there for a long time, letting the quiet fill the room. In the weeks that followed, life kept moving. The snow melted, the days stretched longer, and the apple trees in my backyard began to bloom again. I spent more evenings outside sitting on the porch with Jada, or sometimes just alone watching the world slow down. One evening as the sun dipped low, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Kayla, one of the earliest students from the garage. Inside was a photo of her standing beside a truck she'd rebuilt herself. The caption on the back said, "I got hired full-time. Couldn't have done it without you." I smiled and pinned the photo to the corkboard above my desk. The collection there had grown faces, notes, small victories. Each one told a piece of the same story. When I stepped outside that night, the air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass. The world felt open, like it was waiting for something new. I looked up at the apple blossoms glowing pale in the moonlight and thought about all the years I'd spent trying to prove my worth. Somewhere along the way, that need had turned into something steadier purpose. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, I realized justice hadn't arrived all at once. It had come slowly, piece by piece, built with the same patience I'd used to fix every broken thing that came through my hands. What I didn't know then was that the greatest proof of that would appear in the months to come, something that would close the circle completely. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, the world seemed washed clean. The air carried that mix of mud and promise that always follows a long winter. At the garage, the doors stayed open most days, sunlight spilling across the floor while engines hummed in rhythm. The students joked, more laughed louder, and left their handprints everywhere on toolboxes, on door frames, even on the office walls. I didn't mind. Every smudge was proof that the work was alive. One afternoon, Sam stopped by my office holding a clipboard and wearing that grin that always meant he had an idea. "You're not going to believe this," he said, dropping the papers on my desk. "The state wants to feature our program in a public broadcast. They're calling it Women Who Build." I stared at the form for a long moment before I answered. "You sure they got the right shop?" He laughed. "They sure did. They want you to tell your story." The filming took place in late May. A small crew came in, 2 cameras, one sound tech, and a young producer named Rachel, who asked all the right questions. She wanted shots of the women working the engines being rebuilt, the small details that made the place feel like a community. I tried to keep out of the spotlight, but somehow they always turned the camera back toward me. When the segment aired a few weeks later, my phone lit up with messages. Friends, old coworkers, even distant relatives reached out. But one message stood out. It was from my mom. "We watched together," she wrote. "Your father cried. So did I." A few days later, I drove over to their house. The same front porch I'd once dreaded walking up felt different now. Mom met me at the door, no apron this time, just a simple cardigan and a soft smile. Dad was inside watching the news, his reading glasses slipping down his nose. "You've made quite a name for yourself, kiddo," he said. "About time the world caught up." We sat around the kitchen table for hours, sharing stories that didn't need repairing. There were no defenses left, no scorekeeping, just quiet gratitude. Before I left, Mom walked me to the porch and pressed a small box into my hand. "Your grandfather's pocket watch," she said. "He gave it to your dad when he graduated, but I think it belongs with you." I ran my thumb over the tarnished brass. It still ticked. That night, I brought it home and set it on the workbench beside my tools. Its slow, steady rhythm filled the space between breaths. For the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't building for survival anymore. I was building for legacy. In June, the community center hosted a statewide trades conference. People from all over came to see what we'd started. Teachers, apprentices, engineers, young women just looking for their first foothold. Lily showed up standing by the back wall with a clipboard and a lanyard marked guest speaker. She looked nervous but proud. When her turn came, she walked to the microphone and spoke about second chances, about learning to lead with humility instead of image. When she finished, she looked at me across the room and smiled. It wasn't the showy kind of smile I remembered from her TV days. It was quieter, real. Afterward, we found each other near the exit. "You did good," I told her. She laughed softly. "You started it," she said. "I just followed the map." For the first time, it felt like we were standing side by side, not opposite sides of a line. The months that followed moved fast. The program spread to 4 more cities. Kayla, the young woman who'd once been scared to start over, became one of our lead mentors. Jada teased me about being boss lady of the Midwest, but she still showed up with coffee every Friday morning. Life had found its rhythm again, full but peaceful. Late that summer, I drove out to the edge of town where the fields stretched wide and the air smelled faintly of rain. I parked on the gravel shoulder and watched the sunset dip behind the grain silos. The sky glowed in shades of amber and rose the kind of light that makes everything look softer, even the past. It struck me then how far things had come since that one Thanksgiving, when I sat alone with a slice of pie and a quiet house. The girl they called a loser had learned to stop asking for a seat at the table and instead built one long enough for everyone who'd ever been turned away. That truth carried me through every season that followed. Justice didn't come in the form of revenge or apology. It came through the quiet work of rebuilding through hands that fixed, through patience that held, through faith that even what's broken can be made whole again. And maybe that's what I was meant to learn all along, that the worth people refuse to see in you doesn't disappear. It waits steady as an engine under the hood until you're ready to turn the key yourself. So if you've ever been told you don't belong, remember this: you don't need their permission to start over. You only need your own hands and the will to build something better. Thanks for listening to my story. If it found its way to you tonight, maybe that's for a reason. Take a moment to share it with someone who needs reminding that quiet strength still counts and that freedom once earned doesn't ask to be understood.